There are some cases where the hardest part isn't figuring out who the killer is. Today's case is one of them. Within just a few hours of it happening, the story had spread across Indonesia and was being described as one of the most horrifying, most bizarre cases the country had ever witnessed. What made it so strange was that everything seemed clear from the very beginning. There were witnesses. There was video footage. Someone was arrested right at the scene. And yet, to this day, no one truly understands why it happened. Not the police, not the doctors, not even the people who had lived next to the killer for 14 years. It happened in Siamis Regency, West Java Province, on the island of Java, in May 2024. But to understand what happened, we have to go all the way back to the beginning. In 2010, a family of 4 moved to the neighborhood of Sindang Jaya, in Cisantrol village, Rengka district. They came from the Cikole area of Rajadesa district, also in Siamis Regency, not very far away. The husband's name was Tarsum. His wife was Yanti. With them were their 2 children, a daughter and a son. At the time, the neighborhood head was a man named Yoyo Tarya. Years later, he could still clearly remember the day that family moved in. Tarsum was middle-aged at the time. He was thin, with sun-darkened skin and hair already streaked with gray. He made a living slaughtering and selling goat and sheep meat, a very common occupation in rural West Java. He kept a small herd of goats behind the house, fattening them for months before either selling them alive to livestock traders or slaughtering them himself and taking the meat to the local market. On top of that, he took whatever manual jobs he could find, doing whatever work people asked him to do. Yanti was a few years younger than her husband and was known as a quiet, private woman. The neighbors only knew that she took care of the household, looked after their 2 children, and was deeply religious. She often went to the neighborhood mosque to attend Quran study sessions with other women. It was both a religious activity and one of the few opportunities for the women in the village to get together and talk about their homes and their children. As the years passed, their eldest daughter got married and moved into a home of her own. That left only 3 people in the small house in Sindang Jaya: the husband, the wife, and their youngest son, who was in his 2nd year at a vocational high school. What makes this story so difficult to understand, and what everyone in the neighborhood kept repeating for months afterward, is this. In the eyes of everyone who lived around him, Tarsum was a good man. Yoyo Tarya recalled, "Tarsum was a good person. He genuinely cared about people. He was even willing to sacrifice himself for others." Other neighbors said exactly the same thing. He was hardworking. He greeted everyone he met. He woke up early every morning to feed his goats, and he spoke to them gently, almost as if they could understand him. He and his wife were seen as a harmonious couple. Both attended religious services regularly and took part in neighborhood activities whenever something needed to be done. In more than a decade of living in Sindang Jaya, Tarsum had never once had any trouble with the authorities. There is one more detail, and I need to make this clear from the start. This detail has never been confirmed by police. After the incident, Indonesian internet users found a TikTok account believed to belong to Tarsum. The username sounded simple, unassuming, roughly translated as "the confused old man." It was a small account, with just over 1,700 followers. There was nothing unusual about the content, mostly goats inside their pen, newborn kids. Mixed in were a few clips of the hills in the early morning, and a glass of black coffee sitting on a windowsill. The final post was dated April 3rd, 2022. 2 days earlier, the account owner had written a brief personal message. In essence, they were the words of someone who needed a shoulder to lean on. And then came silence. For 2 full years. If that account really did belong to him, then perhaps it was the first time a man who never wanted to burden anyone had tried to say that something was wrong, and no one heard him. The trouble began with his business. The goat trade was unpredictable. Farmers had to put up money to buy the animals, then keep paying for feed and medicine for months before they could finally sell a batch. If prices were good, they made a profit. If they weren't, all that money stayed tied up in the pen, while the goats still had to be fed every single day. During those years, the prices of basic necessities in Indonesia kept rising, and people in the area began cutting back on spending. Goat meat was never an everyday food. It was something people bought for holidays or special family occasions. When money became tight, it was one of the first things they stopped buying. And because of that, Tarsum's goats became harder and harder to sell. He tried to make ends meet. At first, he asked people he knew in the neighborhood to lend him a little rice, a little sugar. But in a place where everyone knew everyone else, knocking on a neighbor's door to ask for a loan wasn't an easy thing to do. The more often you had to borrow, the harder it became to ask. And for a man whom his neighbors described as someone who would rather suffer a loss himself than let someone else suffer, it must have been agonizing. So he turned to other sources of money. He borrowed to cover one shortfall. Then he borrowed again to pay off the previous loan. By the time his business finally collapsed, the only thing left was a stack of debt papers. In rural Indonesian culture, the responsibility of supporting the entire family falls almost entirely on the husband's shoulders. It isn't only about money, it's also about honor in the eyes of the community. When that role falls apart, what often comes with it is not sympathy, but shame. And shame is rarely spoken out loud. People in the neighborhood began to notice that Tarsum was changing. His morning smile became less frequent. Then it disappeared completely. He went out less, spoke less, and would often sit alone for long periods of time. On some days, neighbors could hear raised voices coming from inside the house. Yanti reached out to relatives on both sides of the family to talk about her husband. She told them he was no longer the man he used to be. And then came the night of April 30th, 2024. That night, Yo-Yo heard a loud commotion coming from Tarsum's house. He ran over. What he saw inside stopped him cold. Tarsum was slamming his own head against the wall, then wrapping both hands around his own throat. And there was only one person trying to stop him. Yanti clung to her husband's hands, desperately trying to pull them away while screaming for someone to come help. She was alone until the neighbors rushed inside. It took several men working together to restrain him. The situation was serious enough that neighborhood officials personally took Tarsum to the Rangka Community Health Center. The assessment was that he had mild depression, could be treated as an outpatient, but needed to be monitored. The center prescribed sedatives for 2 days and instructed the family to report back on his condition. Yo-Yo Tarya, meanwhile, did what he believed was the most necessary thing at the time. He confiscated the slaughter knife Tarsum normally used to kill goats and took it away for safekeeping. I want to pause here for a moment. That neighborhood had not abandoned him. But there was one more thing that happened that night. Something Yo-Yo would only understand much later. That evening, Tarsum unexpectedly showed up at his house. There had been no arrangement. There was no obvious reason for the visit. Yo-Yo opened the door, surprised, invited him in, and asked what was wrong. Tarsum didn't answer. He simply sat down, lowered his face toward the floor, said nothing, and wouldn't look anyone in the eye. He stayed like that for a long time. Then he finally spoke. Just one sentence. He said, "Please look after my youngest son for me." Yo-Yo froze. He asked him what he meant by that, whether something was wrong. Tarsum only gave a faint smile. He said he was fine. Then he explained that a friend on the island of Kalimantan had invited him to come help work at a fish pond, and that he might go. Maybe things would be better for him there. It sounded like a hopeful plan. But Yo-Yo still felt that something was terribly wrong. There was a heaviness in Tarsum's voice. His eyes were empty. Yo-Yo pressed him several more times, asking whether something was happening at home, whether there was a problem between him and Yanti. Tarsum only shook his head and repeated that everything was fine. Only later did people learn that Yo-Yo's house wasn't the only place Tarsum visited that night. He had also gone to several other homes in the neighborhood. And then that night passed. The husband had been taken for an examination and brought home. The slaughter knife was now being kept at someone else's house. The village breathed a sigh of relief and believed the worst had passed. Yanti believed it too. She had managed to save her husband one more time. 3 days later, it was Friday morning, May 3rd, 2024. In rural West Java, the day begins early. By 3 in the morning, the district market was already starting to come alive. Vegetable sellers, fish vendors, meat sellers, they'd left home while it was still pitch dark so they could set up their stalls in time. By 6, the entire neighborhood of Sindangjaya was awake. Roosters crowed, motorcycles started up, and the sound of loudspeakers from the mosque carried through the village. Friday is the most important day of the week for Muslims. It's the day of congregational prayer, when the men of the village gather at the mosque around noon. Because of that, a Friday morning in an Indonesian village often feels a little calmer than an ordinary day. Yanti woke up early and prepared to attend Quran study, just as she had done every Friday morning for years. She stepped out of the house and began walking toward the village road. Their family home stood slightly apart from the others, about 70 meters from the surrounding houses. The path leading away from the house ran along a small slope, only a few dozen steps long. In a neighborhood where it took barely a minute to walk from one house to another, 70 meters was already a considerable distance. Only later did people realize that this distance was exactly what allowed everything to happen before anyone had time to react. That morning, several villagers passed along that stretch of road. They saw Tarsum and Yanti arguing loudly outside, about 30 meters from their house. Try to picture the scene. A middle-aged married couple standing outside their home, arguing at 7:30 in the morning. In an Indonesian village, it was hardly something worth stopping for. Every married couple argued sometimes. People glanced over, then kept walking. They still had to get to the fields or make it to work on time. Not one of them could have imagined how far that argument was about to go. Then came a scream. Several nearby households heard it. But just like the people passing by, they assumed it was only another argument between husband and wife, like the ones before. The neighborhood had already become used to hearing raised voices from Tarsum's house from time to time, so no one went over to check. Then the screaming stopped, and the sloping road fell quiet again. Meanwhile, Yo-Yo had left home early and was already on his way to work. His phone rang. On the other end was a resident from the neighborhood. The caller told him that Tarsum was having another episode and that he needed to come back immediately. The moment Yo-Yo heard that, his mind went straight back to what had happened 3 days earlier. Maybe Tarsum was trying to hurt himself again. Maybe it would once again take several people to restrain him. Yo-Yo turned around and headed back toward the neighborhood. That was what he prepared himself to face. A man hurting himself. And once again, Yo-Yo would have to stop him. But as soon as he reached the road at the entrance to the neighborhood, he saw something he couldn't make sense of. Tarsum was standing there, alone. In his hands was a red plastic basin, the kind people normally use to hold things in the kitchen. And he was calling out, trying to sell. As he walked, he called to people in the same familiar vendor's voice the neighborhood had heard for more than a decade whenever he had fresh goods to sell. Yo-Yo froze. He couldn't understand what was happening. The market was only a few steps away. If Tarsum wanted to sell meat, he could simply go there. Why was he carrying a basin around the neighborhood, calling out to people like this? Then Tarsum saw him. He walked closer. Yo-Yo later recalled that moment. He greeted me, then said, "Please buy some of this meat from me. It's Yanti's meat. Yanti is gone now." Yo-Yo stood there, completely frozen. In Tarsum's hand beside the basin was also a knife. Yo-Yo later said that at first he still couldn't believe it. He tried to tell himself that maybe he had misheard. Maybe Tarsum was having another episode and rambling incoherently. But when he looked down into the basin, he understood. Tarsum turned away and said he still had to go back to where he had been, to get more. Yo-Yo didn't wait another second. He ran. He ran straight to the Rancha police station without stopping once. Later, when he was asked whether any other villagers had also been offered the meat, Yo-Yo said he didn't know. At that moment, there was only one thing left in his mind that he had to do. He recalled, "I was at a complete loss. I wanted to help, but I couldn't. The last time I was still able to stop him because he wasn't carrying a weapon. This time was different." While Yo-Yo was running, another resident deeper inside the neighborhood had just come across Tarsum as well. This time, it was near the small neighborhood watch post, where the men of the area usually sat every day, drinking coffee and talking. Tarsum was squatting there. He was working at something with intense concentration, his movements steady and calm, just like a butcher going about his usual work. The man, curious, walked closer. At first, he still didn't understand what he was seeing. He simply thought the neighborhood butcher was doing some prep work in the shade. Then he saw what was lying on the ground. A scream tore through the morning, and the small neighborhood erupted into chaos. People poured out of the surrounding houses. Some ran away. Some stood frozen where they were, and others pulled out their phones, raised them, and began recording. By that same morning, those videos had spread across Indonesian social media. In one of the clips, a man's voice could be heard repeatedly reciting a prayer, over and over, his voice trembling badly. Yo-Yo later confirmed that it was the voice of the head of Sindangjaya Hamlet. Yo-Yo recalled, "That viral video where you can hear someone praying, that was the Hamlet head's voice. At the time, he was pointing toward Tarsum, and Tarsum was holding the knife up to his own neck. The residents kept their distance. No one dared to go near him. At one point, Tarsum dropped to his knees, bent his body forward, and made a gesture of prostration. Seeing this, a few men stepped forward. He immediately tightened his grip on the knife. The entire neighborhood stood there like that, surrounding a man they had still been greeting every morning just days earlier. At the same time, a local soldier's phone rang. His name was Sergeant Karnita, the military officer assigned to Sisentrol village. In Indonesia, each village has a resident military officer like this, known as a babinsa. Their job is to stay close to the community, monitor the local area, and support local authorities when needed. The person calling him was the head of Sindangjaya Hamlet. On the other end of the line came the report that there had been a killing. Sergeant Karnita immediately asked permission from his commanding officer in the Rangka area, then headed straight for the scene. When he arrived, the crowd was still standing in a circle around Tarsum, and Tarsum was still holding the knife. The attempt to restrain him was extremely tense. Karnita ordered all the villagers to step back, then began walking toward Tarsum alone, one step at a time. As he approached, he called out that he was carrying nothing and only wanted Tarsum to put the knife down. At one point, Tarsum actually threw the knife away, but the crowd behind Karnita suddenly erupted in shouting, and Tarsum immediately bent down and picked it up again. Then he lunged. The first stab was aimed at the head of Sisentrol village, but Karnita managed to deflect it. The next came at Karnita himself. He slipped and fell, blocking the blade by inches, but the knife still slashed his abdomen. He kicked upward, then pinned Tarsum hard to the ground and shouted for the villagers to come help. Only then were they finally able to tie him up. The entire scene was also recorded by residents. In another video taken afterward, Tarsum could be seen lying still, already bound, waiting for the authorities to arrive. Not long after, the police reached the scene. They sealed off the area with police tape and covered parts of the scene with cloth. 3 separate locations in the neighborhood were cordoned off, and this may be the detail that stayed with people the most. Karnita himself later said that the moment Tarsum was pinned to the ground, he seemed to change completely. He was no longer aggressive. He begged for forgiveness, regret clearly visible on his face, like someone who had suddenly come back to his senses and was pleading for help. Karnita said, "It meant that he had regained some awareness." But only a short time later, when police were escorting him to the vehicle, he began resisting again. He struggled. He shouted. He returned to that same confused state, like a man who didn't understand why he was being taken away. Then the vehicle door closed. The car left Sindangjaya and headed toward the Rangka police station, and the entire neighborhood was left behind. From the local station, he was transferred to the Kiamis Regency Police Headquarters, where he was placed in a separate holding room, isolated from the other detainees. Police wanted to question him that same night, but they couldn't. He sat there, staring into space, occasionally murmuring a prayer under his breath. But the moment an investigator mentioned his wife, he would scream and slam his head against the wall in the bars. Akmal, the chief of Siamis Regency Police, said, "The suspect's psychological state was unstable. At times he was silent, at times agitated. He was not in a condition to be questioned." The officers on duty that night also noted one more detail. One investigator recalled, "Even in his sleep, he kept calling out, 'Yanti, Yanti.' He seemed to be suffering from very severe depression." Meanwhile, back in Sindang Jaya, police began taking statements from a series of witnesses. Family members, neighbors, staff from the Rangka Community Health Center who had treated Tarsum 3 days earlier. The most important witness was the couple's own child. On May 5th, the chief of the district police said, "Based on our examination of the witnesses, especially the key witness, who is the child of both the suspect and the victim, we obtained information about the family's financial situation, and it was a considerable burden." By May 6th, police had officially named Tarsum a suspect and opened a criminal case under Articles 338 and 340 of the Indonesian Criminal Code for murder and premeditated murder. The maximum possible penalty was death. The district police chief explained that authorities didn't need to wait for the results of a psychiatric evaluation before initiating criminal proceedings, because the evidence of what had happened was already overwhelming. But what about the family's debt? How much did they actually owe? Joko Prihatin, head of the Criminal Investigation Unit, confirmed that Tarsum owed more than 100 million rupiah, equivalent to a little over $6,000. To someone living in a city, that amount might not sound enormous. But this was the debt of a goat farmer in rural West Java, a man whose entire monthly income, even in a good month, might amount to only a few % of that figure. For him, 100 million rupiah wasn't just a number. It was a mountain. Joko also made two things clear. The debt consisted of bank loans and personal loans, not money borrowed through online lending apps, and it had nothing to do with gambling. Police also confirmed that before this incident, Tarsum had no prior criminal record. As the investigation continued, a wave of rumors exploded across Indonesian social media. The first rumor claimed that Tarsum's child had accumulated 150 million rupiah in online gambling debt, and that creditors had repeatedly come to the family home demanding payment. The claim spread so quickly that the family itself had to respond. A representative said, "I confirmed it directly with the child. The claim about the 150 million rupiah debt is false." Yoyo also said that no such story had ever circulated in the neighborhood. The second rumor went even further. People claimed that Tarsum had performed some kind of mystical ritual to bring wealth, and that unseen voices had then urged him to attack his wife. The rumor fit neatly into local folklore because it gave people a simple explanation for something that seemed impossible to explain. It spread across Indonesia and even made its way onto television. But to this day, no authority has ever confirmed it. It remains nothing more than a rumor. On May 6th, Andi Fatima Yuniasari, a psychiatrist from Siamis Regency General Hospital, was brought directly to the police station to examine Tarsum. The evaluation couldn't be completed that day, so she had to return the following day to continue. By the second day, there had been a change. Joko said, "The doctor told us that he had started cooperating and was able to answer questions." Then, while he was answering, Tarsum asked the doctor a question. He asked how his family was doing. He asked how his wife was. I want to let that question sit here for a moment. To this day, no one knows for certain what it meant. Maybe he truly didn't remember. Maybe some part of his mind had refused to accept what had just happened. Or maybe it was simply an unconscious question that came from more than 20 years of living beside the same person. Of course, no one could answer that question, and perhaps no one ever will. Dr. Andi Fatima concluded that the case was beyond the scope of an on-site examination and recommended that Tarsum be transferred to a specialized psychiatric facility. Tarsum was taken to Cisarua Psychiatric Hospital in Lambang, West Bandung Regency, where he underwent 14 days of continuous observation. On May 22nd, he was returned to the holding cell at the Ciamis Regency Police Headquarters. By then, he was able to communicate normally again, completely different from the day he was first arrested, although he was still kept separated from the other detainees. Then, on June 12, 2024, police conducted a reconstruction of the crime scene. It was perhaps the strangest image of the entire case. The reconstruction took place right in Sindang Jaya, across 5 different locations. It began at the house, then moved to the sloping road, the front yard of another resident's home, the road near the cemetery, and finally the neighborhood watch post at the entrance to the road. A total of 54 scenes were reenacted, based entirely on the statements of 5 witnesses. Representatives from the prosecutor's office were present. The defense attorney was present. Residents of the neighborhood stood around the outside, watching. Only one person was missing. Tarsum wasn't brought there. His role was played by a stand-in. The entire reconstruction was built from the memories of people who had witnessed events from the outside. The one person who truly knew what had happened was completely absent from it. On June 19th, the case file was transferred to the Ciamis Regency Prosecutor's Office. Procedurally, everything was moving in the direction of a trial. But that trial never happened. The psychiatric observation found that Tarsum was suffering from a mental disorder severe enough that he wasn't considered capable of bearing criminal responsibility. Under Indonesian law, a person in that condition cannot be brought to trial. Police issued a decision to terminate the investigation. And just like that, the case file was closed. There would be no trial, and no one would receive a sentence. As far as the law was concerned, Yanti's case ended there. On September 4, 2024, Tarsum was taken by police and the Ciamis Regency Social Services Office to Marzuki Mahdi Hospital in Bogor for treatment. On September 20th, after that treatment ended, he was transferred to the Fala Martha Social Rehabilitation Center in Sukabumi, where he was expected to remain for about 3 months. The reason he was being moved from place to place was simple and deeply sad. Nonok Nurlina, an official responsible for social rehabilitation at the agency, explained that the community wasn't yet ready to accept him back. It wasn't just the residents of Sindang Jaya. His relatives in Rangka and his former hometown in Rajadesa weren't able to take him in either. There was nowhere for him to go. She said, "His overall condition has improved. He's now able to communicate and interact with others. The concern is that the behavior could happen again, so the decision was made to continue treatment first." According to the plan, once his rehabilitation was complete, he would be placed in a social care facility for people with mental disabilities. But the agency hadn't yet determined which facility would accept him, and that was the last public information available. From the end of 2024 until now, there have been no further news reports about Tarsum. He disappeared from the public record, just as quietly as his social media account stopped posting in April 2022. As for the 2 children, they had to start over from the beginning, living with relatives, carrying a label they never chose. Looking back at the entire story, one question keeps coming back. Could any of this have been prevented? The family had reported his condition to the health center. He had been taken in for an examination. The neighborhood head had taken away the knife. That village had done almost everything it could. The problem lay somewhere else. Rural community health centers are understaffed and lack psychiatric specialists. A person suffering from severe depression who can still sit quietly and answer a few questions can easily be classified as a mild case. Then there is the belief that men are supposed to endure, that speaking up is a sign of weakness. Because of that, warning signs are often misread. An outburst is dismissed as a bad temper. Withdrawal is dismissed as exhaustion. And asking someone to look after your child can sound like nothing more than an ordinary goodbye. If there is someone around you who is changing, growing quiet, saying things that sound unusual, please don't ignore it. Sometimes asking if they're okay changes nothing. But sometimes, it's the only thing there is still time to do. And perhaps that is why this story leaves behind two questions. Should someone who has lost the capacity to understand their actions still be convicted, when the fact remains that Yanti is dead and her two children never even got to see the case go to trial? And if that person has completed treatment and can communicate normally again, does someone like that deserve a chance to return to the community? I don't have the answers. Let me know what you think in the comments. That's where today's video ends.